The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Sick of all the doom and gloom in the news these days? Apparently, you're not alone. Tonight, we'll examine what's at stake with more people opting out of the daily grind of daily news. Then, author Mark Burry on the meteoric rise and fall of Canadian media mogul George McCullough, who merged two newspapers to create the Globe and Mail. It's Tuesday, October 18th, and that's next on The Agenda. There's an old saying in the news business, if it bleeds, it leads. It's a somewhat gruesome notion, but to look across the headlines and top stories today, there's plenty of it. War, pandemic, natural disasters, and crime. And new research shows it's having the opposite effect on viewership that it maybe once did. With us now on why people seem to be increasingly tuning out the news. And as is our custom, we're going to introduce our guest from furthest away to closest to our studio, starting in San Francisco, California, with Adam Mastroianni, postdoctoral fellow at the Columbia School of Business. In Washington, D.C., investigative journalist Amanda Ripley, who writes for The Atlantic, Politico, and The Washington Post, among others, and whose latest book is called High Conflict: Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out. And in Quebec City, Quebec, Colette Brun, Director of the Center for Media Studies at Laval University, and we are delighted to welcome the three of you to our program tonight for a subject that is causing plenty of consternation, I can tell you, at places like this, which are presumably in the business of trying to attract viewership, and what you've suggested challenges that. So, Amanda, let's get started here. Earlier this summer, you did an op-ed about the fact that you no longer read the news. You're a journalist, Amanda. Isn't that a bit like a priest confessing that they no longer believe in God?
Yes, it is. It was a very embarrassing and shameful feeling for years. I actually do still read the news, but I had to cut way back. I no longer watch the news, which I probably shouldn't admit on this show. But yeah, I found that I really would be depleted and drained after my usual morning news diet, which was quite heavy for many years. I mean, I was a journalist and I had to read a lot of news, but about 5 or 6 years ago, it just seemed like I couldn't function very well after I read the news. So I kept pushing it to later in the day, you know, thinking that if I just waited till sundown like a vampire, that maybe then would be the right time to consume the news. And for years this went on until like other journalist friends of mine started saying that they too had to limit their news consumption. And finally I started thinking that maybe it wasn't just that I had gone soft, although that's probably part of it, but also the way the news is framed and delivered and selected is often, I think, designed to make us insane, even if it's not always intentional.
Well, we'll follow up more on this in a bit, but I just want to understand. So you're telling me you watch no, sort of like the 6:30 American network newscasts, you don't watch that? You don't watch any of the primetime lineups of CNN, MSNBC? Like, you don't do that?
Never. Not for years, no. And that's, I mean, to be fair, you know, my job doesn't require me to do that, and your job does, right? So it depends on the person. But also there's a lot of research that taking the news in through the video format is just much more, much harder on you cognitively and spiritually than reading it.
Well, Adam knows what you're talking about because he wrote a piece earlier this year comparing news consumption to nicotine addiction. Adam, why don't you make the case for us here? How are they the same?
So it used to be that people would start their day with a nice cigarette, and people would think, that's a totally fine way to live your life. That's a good down-home tradition for everybody. And then we found out that that shortens your life. And I think we are discovering the same thing about news consumption, that this thing that we used to see as almost a patriotic duty is, in fact, I think, driving us apart and making us feel insane. So I had a similar experience to Amanda. During the Trump administration, I was reading a lot of news, and I would imagine myself throttling a Trump supporter, most often my brother-in-law. And then I thought to myself, I don't want to live like this. And I stopped, and then it felt like a war that used to be fought in my head was now being fought on Neptune instead. And it was a much, much better feeling.
I mean, we know for a fact that smoking will shorten your life. Do you believe that overconsumption of news will also shorten your life?
I wouldn't go so far as to say it's as bad as lighting up a cigarette, but it is the case that living your life in a state of chronic stress isn't good for you. So I also don't think it's going to make you live longer either.
Colette, you study media consumption in Canada, and I wonder whether you can tell us whether media consumption is declining in Canada.
Well, we do find that there is a higher level of news avoidance. So the Digital News Report this year, which Amanda cited in her article, found that in most markets, including Canada, people who said they were avoiding news at least sometimes was up. So we're about at 42% of people say they'll avoid it sometimes or often, and 71% including occasionally. So that may seem like a lot for a journalist, but it's probably, as your previous guest said, pretty healthy, considering that news is now something that we have to avoid. It wasn't always the case.
And do they give explanations as to why they are avoiding the news?
Well, the most often cited reasons from a list that we gave them are the negative effect on their mood and the fact that there's too much news on topics like politics and COVID. So this survey was done in the early months of the year. This was during the throes of the convoy protests in Canada, which may explain some of that, and the context generally of the pandemic fatigue and well, there wasn't the war on Ukraine yet, but just the sense that things in the world are somewhat depressing right now. So, I hear my colleagues in the U.S. And I sympathize with what you had to go through. But we do see similar things in Canada.
And one more follow-up. Do you believe there is a correlation between less news consumption and less trust for legacy media?
Well, there certainly is in our findings, and we do see that trust is also going down. And actually, that's one of the answers that people gave for avoiding the news, is that they found that news was untrustworthy and biased.
Amanda, you told us earlier about what you are no longer prepared to watch. I want to get a sense of what your media diet was like when you were, I guess by today's standards, overindulging. What was a day like for you?
Well, I would read 3 newspapers. I would keep CNN on mute in my office at Time Magazine. I would listen to NPR, public radio here in the States as I got ready in the morning. And the biggest difference was that I enjoyed it. Like, I felt like it made me more curious, not less. And I think that's the shift that I felt happening, that it made me feel worse. It made me feel less curious. I felt like I could scroll through most headlines in the New York Times, and I knew what they were going to say. There was a lot of catastrophizing and also a lot of very objectively hard, painful news, right? So I think it's many things at once, and also the fact that the news is just everywhere all the time. It's been aerosolized, right? Like, you can't avoid it. So it's a very different experience than it was, and I really miss that. And I naively probably hope to get back to it. I actually think there is a way to deliver the news and frame the news that is designed for human consumption. And I just think journalism has to evolve.
Was there one incident in particular that made you say, okay, this is too much for me now and I got to scale back?
I would say it was one of the school shootings. It's hard to pick one because there's so many, unfortunately, here in the US. But reading about those school shootings is just so gutting, and you feel so hopeless here that you have nothing to do with that energy, right? Like, it is important to feel anger and to feel pain and to feel sadness. That is very important. But it is also important to convert those into something useful. And what I find is that the focus, the sort of relentless focus on the negative and on despair, leaves us with nowhere to go. Now, I will say there are exceptions to this. And there are journalists and even news outlets that are doing this differently. And they leave you with, they do look at the hard stories, and they leave you with a sense that, there are people trying to work on this. And even if you personally can't fix it, which would be nice, there are people elsewhere trying to work on this. And it just makes it so that you can kind of get up and get out of bed, right? Which is important. I think we can all agree.
Did you seek therapy for what was becoming an increasingly problematic thing for you?
I did. I asked my therapist, I was like, look, I used to cover terrorism and crime and disasters, and I cover conflict now. I cannot read the news. Like, what is wrong with me? It was like I had developed an allergy to the news and I wanted some kind of medication. And she said, well, I have the answer. Stop reading the news. And I said, well, I don't feel like that's a great option. Like, I want to be informed, and even putting aside my work, I feel like it's important to know what's going on in the world. And it was such a core part of my identity for decades that it was unimaginable to totally give it up. And I still feel that way. But I do think that some of the onus here is on journalists to do this differently. And so I spent the past year just trying to interview people who understand what humans really need to make sense of the world and what we're not getting from the news. And I think for me, those things are hope, agency, and dignity. I'm sure other people have other ideas, but I think that's the most exciting piece of this is, how could this be better?
We're going to come back to that in a moment. But Adam, I want to get a sense from you. Again, in your overindulgent days, what was a typical day for you in terms of news consumption?
Oh, I would scroll, baby. I'd have this feeling that if I could just scroll to the end, then maybe all the problems would go away. That they were in fact problems because I hadn't read the headlines yet. So I'd load up a news app on my phone in the morning or breaks at work. I'd listen to podcasts while I was running. I'd save articles to my phone. I wouldn't so much call it an information diet as it was sort of an information all-you-can-eat buffet.
And how did it make you feel?
Bad. Just this sense of, much like Amanda said, I feel bad about these things, but I'm one person among billions. What am I going to do? And I realized, too, it was distracting me from the actual things that I could do. And I think we all could do. We're embedded in social networks in our lives where we have a lot of power. We, each of us, no matter who we are, have the power every day to make the lives of the people around us much better or much worse, depending on what we do. So I'm a teacher, I'm a researcher, I'm a member of a family, I have a partner. All of those people are counting on me to be the best version of myself. And I won't do that if I am worried about problems that I can't solve and just going over and over again on them in my head.
And how do you feel now that you've cut way back?
I feel great. And it's also not that I don't take in information. So I still read a ton of stuff. So I write a blog on Substack. I read a bunch of other people who are writing there, neuroscientists, economists. And so I feel like this idea of to be informed means to read the news or to watch the news, I think is a huge PR victory for the news. And I think it's totally wrong that there's so much information out there that isn't going to be delivered to you in the format of here's what happened today. Because often the most important things are things that happened long ago. And so I also read a lot of history as well.
Colette, who avoids the news more, men or women?
In Canada, it tends to be women, and women also have different reasons for avoiding the news. They do cite more that it affects their mood. But it's really interesting to hear these guests who are finally not really completely avoiding the news, but trying to get a more healthy diet. It's a little bit like saying, well, I'm swearing off love because of Tinder, just to make kind of maybe a bad analogy. But I think what really needs to be pointed out is that the online environment is really quite toxic. And just being on your screen all the time scrolling is probably not the best way to consume news. We all know that. But it's hard to make a real as a news consumer, it's hard to really filter your choices and make those smart, have a good, healthy news diet in this environment. It requires a lot of effort, I think.
No, there's no question the online environment in terms of comments you might see on Twitter or underneath a YouTube video or something like that, some of that can be just appallingly awful. But do people, in your experience, not make the distinction between those comments and okay, let me put it this way, reputable pieces by reputable legacy organizations that supposedly have some trust and distinctiveness attached to them?
Well, it really depends to whom you ask the question. For many people, those traditionally reputable sources are the people that they consider the most problematic, and there is a high level of distrust towards traditional news media in certain parts of the population. So I don't think we should ignore that. And the fact that we consume this all in these bits and pieces that are just kind of bombarded at us. Of course, for people who are experts, for expert journalists or expert analysts, they do know the difference. But for the typical user, and I would say even for myself, it's the overall experience of having all of that kind of thrown at you, and it's hard to really kind of focus on those bits that are more empowering or generating more hate. We do, as human beings, tend to focus on whatever stimulates negative emotions like anger, fear, despair. It's unhealthy, but there are survival reasons why we do this. So we have to learn to consume news differently. And I think our your two other guests are really good examples of that.
Well, you say differently. Let me ask you, have you cut back in the amount of news that you consume?
Mostly because of time constraints. I mean, I'm a journalism professor, so I would be like a gym teacher saying, don't exercise. So I try to consume news smarter. For sure, television is not a big part of my diet. I tend to watch over my shoulder when my partner is watching political commentary on the daily on the news channels, mostly in French, I must say, in Quebec, so RDI and LCN. And I think it's good to have kind of a general knowledge of that environment, but for sure to be bathing in CNN and Fox every day, I would not feel very good about myself.
No, I appreciate that there's got to be a healthy limit to how much of this you can take in. But I mean, Adam, let me go to you on this. We are living in extremely consequential times. We talked about it off the top. We're still getting over a global pandemic. There is a terrible war in Eastern Europe. There is crime, the climate change. We're seeing disasters upon disasters. Amanda referred to the fact that there seems to be a school shooting in your country. Well, I won't say how often, but it's far too often. Let's put it that way. Is there not a part of you that feels, I am missing something if I don't indulge more than I currently am?
Yeah, I would say two things to that. One is even if you don't purposely seek out the news, it finds you anyway. So I still know the things that are going on. It's impossible to avoid them. And second, I think there are ways of learning about all the important things that are happening in the world that don't rely on engaging with them in the news every day. So for instance, if you want to understand how the financial system works, you shouldn't check the stock market every day. You should find someone who writes very cogently about this and follow them. And that's what I do. So this idea that important things are happening every day, I think is actually very misleading. And when I started only checking the headlines once a week, I realized that so many of the things that seemed so important last week turned out to just be noise. And much like checking stocks every day, you're going to be misled if you're always looking at every up and down instead of stepping back and going, what are actually the important events that are unfolding over time?
There has, Amanda, been some deeply concerning saber rattling between Russia and the United States over the last few weeks as it relates to the potential use of nuclear weapons in Eastern Europe. And I wonder whether or not, do you feel you are missing something by not watching the news to stay on top of what could be a life and death story for so many Americans?
I do not. No, I think there's like stages that you go through. I don't know if Adam feels this way, but at first I felt like that. And that's why I would check it all the time. And I think, especially during the darkest days of the pandemic, I would check it, I think with the subconscious hope that I would find out things were getting better. And then I read this study that came out that looked at the negativity of mainstream media coverage of COVID in the United States and found that it was more negative than scientific journals coverage of COVID and more negative than international news coverage. And that even when there was some glimmer of hope, vaccines were working, caseloads went down, the negativity did not really abate. So I started to feel like, I'm searching for something I'm not going to find here. So of course I am continuing to keep abreast of important news stories like Ukraine, again, like Adam, I've had to admit that my monitoring the situation doesn't make it better. I think there's a trick of the mind where you feel like if I can just keep on top of this, I will protect myself from this horror, and it's just simply not the case. And in the meantime, you can be sacrificing the small opportunities that you do have to make a difference, to be useful. And I think the important thing we sometimes forget is, you're only getting half the news. It's not the full story. It's just not. I mean, I've literally spent my whole life creating the news, and it's not that people are, intentionally cutting out hope, agency, and dignity, but the conventions of journalism and the financial pressures of traditional journalism make it so that I think there's sometimes a tendency to have a distorted picture on the world. And so you miss important things. I've started looking for hope ghosts in stories, is how I think of them. Little things that got cut from the story. And I know this because I've done it, right? So things that got cut from the story that should have maybe been kept in, and then try to research them on my own, because that is a fuller picture of reality. So if we want to be informed, we have to do this differently.
Here's an excerpt from a blog that Adam wrote earlier this year. Adam, you wrote, "I would reluctantly keep reading about bad stuff if that somehow made it go away. But no matter how much I read, bad stuff keeps coming." Which makes sense, because it's not like the news actually led me to do anything about the bad stuff. It kind of felt like my big contribution to the cause was reading and feeling bad. It was like I was floating above all the victims of every bad thing, going, "Don't worry, everybody. I'm here to read all about you and feel awful." That's very funny, although it makes a very serious point. But okay, here's the semi-serious question that comes out of it. Your exposure to all of those terrible things and your ingesting it presumably gave you a level of heightened empathy for the people who were going through all these things. Are you concerned you are now depriving yourself of that empathy because you're no longer exposing yourself to those stories?
Oh, I think that empathy really comes from deep engagement with a story rather than scrolling through and saying like, oh man, there's some bad thing happening somewhere. I sure feel bad about that. So it's not that I won't read anything that resembles news at all. I really like long form pieces where you really get to spend some time with a story. And the point isn't communicating that some new bad thing has happened. It's trying to understand the long-term trends that have created this event, how people are experiencing it, what's going on there. And so I think almost we need a different word for that kind of long form journalism that yeah, it still is about things happening. But the point isn't kind of this horse race coverage of each new tragedy that's emerging every day. So I still feel like I get empathy from that. And in fact, more from just dipping my toe in the news every day. Is
this a problem, Adam, that could be solved if the legacy media simply covered more good, so-called good news stories?
I mean, I don't think so, in part because, I mean, there's a reason why news is the way that it is. They have analytics on the back. They know what people click on. And so, sure, you could write about every new cute puppy that's born, and people will click on that a little bit, but people want to know about the bad things. Just like you want that next hit of a cigarette, you want that next hit of outrage. It can become addicting. And so I think the solution isn't necessarily to change the tenor of the news. I think it may be to change the depth. That if you can get a better sense of what stories really matter and get into them more deeply, which I think means less information overall, but more depth to the information that you have.
I take your point, but I want to follow up on this notion of whether good news is the way we've got to go here. And Colette, to that end, there is actually something called the Good News Network. It is an example of something that is trying to shine the spotlight on more good news stories. And here's an example of some recent headlines. Meditation could protect older people against Alzheimer's was one headline. 70 vultures released into Bulgaria to start wild population after dying out 60 years ago. That sounds like good news. One more here. He taught parents how to play drums and bass so he'd have people to jam with. That sounds like a fun story. I guess my question for you, Colette, is do people really prefer this to a steady drumbeat of negativity?
For sure, there is an audience. I think that would be more of a niche audience for these kinds of news platforms. But I'm more interested in something more similar to what Amanda was referring to, the type of content, and also Adam, the type of content that's more explanatory, that's more what's called solutions journalism, which is not the same as good news, just kind of happy news. It's much more nuanced than that. It talks about problems, but it also gives you some sense of hope or possibility that these problems can be resolved, and it's much more evidence-based, and it's maybe more of an effort for the audience. I mean, so it's maybe more of a highbrow product, but there is some evidence that some lighter forms of solutions journalism, especially on climate change, can actually be an interesting business model as well.
Now, presumably, though, Colette, the major networks know this. They understand that a relentless diet of awful negativity is going to turn people off. Is that not changing their behavior at all?
I mean, the behavior of the news companies?
Indeed, and what they choose to cover and how they cover it, et cetera.
I think my sense of the news industry is that they're not they're trying to juggle all kinds of competing obligations and contradictions in what people say they do, what people say they want, and what they actually click on. So for sure, the negative, and it's actually part of the news mission to talk about what's wrong in the world or what's not going well in the world. Otherwise, that would be more PR, I guess, than news. And it's also a good way to get clicks. But in the long term, it does turn people off. So I'm not sure there is enough attention by the news industry to this problem, and I'm not sure there's an easy solution either.
Well, let's not.
That's the easy answer.
Sure. Let's us not be relentlessly negative about this. In our remaining moments here, let's talk about what we might do about this. And to that end, Amanda, you've quoted Krista Tippett, the host of On Being, that podcast, who said, "I don't actually think we are equipped physiologically or mentally to be delivered catastrophic and confusing news and pictures 24/7. We are analog creatures in a digital world." Okay, if that's true, Amanda, what do you want to do about this?
Yeah, so I think this idea that we've either got to have what we've got now or puppies all the time is a false dichotomy. I really am not interested in good news stories that are sort of plucked from obscurity. I think there is a way to do serious, rigorous reporting on in really important, complicated problems, but do it with a wider lens. So let me give you a quick example and a contrast. So last year, the New York Times did a major multimedia project called Postcards from a World on Fire, chronicling how climate change has altered life in 193 countries. It was a very expensive, labor-intensive project. There was a graphic they created of the Earth in flames, spinning in space. It was incredibly depressing, demoralizing, and paralyzing, in my view. And the same newspaper, not that much later, did another large story on homelessness and focused on how the city of Houston, Texas, had moved 25,000 people experiencing homelessness into homes. And how did they do it? And it wasn't easy, and there's still problems. And, it was rigorously reported, but it was looking at attempts to solve problems, not just marinating in the problem, right? So the interesting thing about that is it leaves you with a question, which is, why isn't my city doing what the city of Houston did? So it can create opportunities to hold your own politicians accountable for what they're doing on hard problems. And it doesn't just leave you feeling like puppies are awesome. There's an actual positive good. And I think, look, in addition to all the important competing interests that Colette mentioned, which are real, I think journalists are just like us. Like they are us, right? I mean, just like Adam feeling like if I read the news, it will get better. Journalists often feel like if I can create such a horrific, eye-catching story, then it will get better. If I can just show you how bad things are. And that is clearly not working, and it's actually having the opposite effect. So some of this is the conventions of legacy media need to evolve for human psychology and for reality.
Adam, last word to you on this. What can we do to make things better?
I think on an individual level, because that's where each of us have some power, we can think of, I use this metaphor in the piece. We can think of gardening your mind, which maybe sounds a little woo, but I do believe in it, that just like you can't eat everything that's put in front of you. We evolved in a place where where there wasn't enough food to go around, and so you didn't have to choose what to eat and not to eat. You just had to make sure you eat, or else you would die. Similarly, we involved in a situation where there wasn't too much information, so anything that you encountered was something that you could take in and think about. Now we live in an era of overabundance, both in terms of nutrition, but also in terms of information. And so I think just like you think carefully about the things that you put in your mouth, you should think carefully about the things that you put in your mind. And more is not always better. So I'd rather eat better food, have better information, than just have so much that I feel sick to my stomach and sick in my head.
Well, I don't know if any of you are going to watch this program, but I'm sure I'm glad that you came on it to share your views with us. Adam Mastroianni, Colette Brun, Amanda Ripley, thanks so much for spending so much time with us on TVO tonight. We're grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's certainly not this way anymore, but once upon a time, Canadians knew the names of the moguls who owned the biggest newspapers in this country. And one of the biggest of those big shots was George McCulloch. He owned 3 of the most important newspapers in Toronto and part of the Toronto Maple Leafs and the Argonauts, and was best pals with some of the most powerful politicians in the country, all despite coming from very modest beginnings. Mark Burry has just written a terrific biography of McCulloch. It's called Big Men Fear Me, the fast life and quick death of Canada's most powerful media mogul. And Mark joins us now here in the studio. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Let's tell the story, and we'll start at the beginning. George McCulloch was born where?
London, Ontario.
And what was his childhood like?
His dad was a union organizer in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Bad time to be a union organizer. So it was a pretty impoverished childhood. And then when he was in grade 9, his high school burnt down, so that was the end of his education.
Didn't get on with his dad too well, did he?
I don't think he got along with his father at all, and but he loved his mother. It was a big thing back then to be a total mama's boy like Mackenzie King, so they had that in common.
He got an entry-level job with the Globe. It was just called the Globe back then. It's not the Globe and Mail yet. And he got fired. And what did he say as he walked out the door?
The next time I come into this place, I'll own it. And he was 24 years old.
And it turned out to be true.
Yeah.
How many years later did he buy the place?
6.5 years later.
How about that? He managed to ingratiate himself into kind of rich society in Toronto, despite his impoverished background, to the point where he becomes part owner of the Maple Leafs, Maple Leaf Gardens, and the Argos. Yep. How did that happen?
Well, he was very social. He had great social skills. He was a big, handsome man who was very sporty, an expert on horses. The man got so much out of life through horses, making business connections with them. The Globe and Mail would not exist without horse racing. It's a key aspect of the formation of that newspaper. His horse won the King's Plate in 1939 when the King was here. So he had all of that going for him. He did like to play shinny. He had a pond up at. He owned the house that the Shoal Ice Clinic is in now, and they would play hockey
in Thornhill.
In
I guess,
Thornhill,
mm-hmm.
Played hockey on the pond there. Boxed, so he had a crooked nose like mine. Yeah, he was just that kind of guy who showed up to hockey games and would sit behind the bench and get in fights with guys from the other teams.
He became pals with Mitch Hepburn, who'd go on to become Premier of Ontario. How did that happen?
They were these boy wonders. Both of them were in their early 30s when their careers began here in Toronto. They were both from southwestern Ontario, so that probably broke a lot of ice. And Mitch trusted McCulloch to look after his money. So McCulloch quit the Globe or was fired, whatever happened, in 1929. So you would think that would be a bad time to go to Bay Street, but within 5 years, McCulloch had 30 people working for him selling gold stocks, and they bought and sold mine stocks that made a lot of money for people like Mitch Hepburn. So Mitch liked to drink, and he liked to make money, and politics didn't pay that well. So McCulloch became his sort of money man and somebody who exerted a lot of control over the government of Ontario when Mitch became premier.
Which would have been in 34, I guess.
34, and then the whole thing with the Globe starts to shape up in 35, 36.
Tell us that. Why do you want to buy the Globe in the first place?
He wanted to buy the Globe, I think, to fulfill the prophecy, and he wanted to buy it for the power. He had sold Globe subscriptions as a child. I mean, when he quit school, that's what he did. He walked up and down the concession roads of southwestern Ontario selling Globe subscriptions until they gave him a job as a reporter when he was like 21, but he'd already been selling. He was the best salesman they had. So he had this, he knew them, he was angry, he wanted to humiliate the proprietor of the Globe, a man named Jaffrey, which he did. It's very clear in the book that that's a big thing for him.
Who cried when he sold it to him?
Literally cried. The whole room, the lawyers they were probably the only ones who were crying, because I'm a lawyer, we don't cry. Because we don't have souls. So the lawyers weren't crying and McCullough wasn't crying, but Jaffrey was there and his wife, she was crying and the kids are crying, and he wrote a tear-stained note saying, with this note, I entrust you with the Globe. And a lot of it was the fact that the Globe, too, there was a big push in Toronto for someone to buy the paper because Jaffrey would not run the horse race results into Toronto. Everybody gambled on horse racing. And McCullough, Jaffrey kept begging him, please don't take horse race results. Please don't do anything that would help the bookies. Please don't sell any liquor ads. And McCullough's like, no, I really can't do that. And he bought the paper.
Well, we got to remind people that there's the Globe, and then there's the Mail and Empire, which is another paper. And he bought that one too, merged them, created the Globe and Mail. Why did he do that?
Well, because the owner of the Mail and Empire, who was living in Montreal, a man named Killam, who had never done him any dirt, so there's no humiliation in this thing, had decided that he wanted out. McCullough was ready to spend the money, and McCullough had hooked up with a guy who had found a massive gold mine in Northern Ontario, who was willing to put up the money not just to buy the Mail and Empire, which was the better paper, by the way. The Mail and Empire was a fantastic newspaper. Its records just don't survive, and people don't see it very often or hear about it. Anyways, the plan was to make the best newspaper in Canada, which they tried very hard to do. Spent a lot of money on it in the worst years of the Depression, and built a fantastic building downtown, the William Wright building. William Wright was the prospector who found this 8-foot vein of gold as he's climbing up a hill up in the Kirkland Lake area. Moss comes off, and there's this 8-foot vein of gold with nuggets and everything in it. Yeah, and Wright doesn't like people, but he loves horses. And McCullough got to him through the horse thing. And he was Wright was in Barrie, and had a horse stable there, and was trying to develop a King's Plate winner. So Wright fronted the money. Eventually McCullough paid it back. And so Wright said, look, I don't care about newspapers. Wright wasn't even Canadian. He was from the UK. Hey, just take it, have fun with it. There were little scandal sheets called Hush, and he actually said he kind of liked to, maybe they should have bought Hush and put out a scandal sheet, but that was no, it was McCullough's game was at all.
No, the game may actually be reflected in the title of your book, Big Men Fear Me.
Right.
Where did that come from?
That came from one of his radio speeches because, hey, when you own the Globe and Mail, that's not quite enough for George McCullough. You used to be able to buy hour-long blocks of time on the CBC, which was just pretty much every radio station in Canada, because CBC owned or fed into private and public radio. And then there were other private radio stations that would also sell you hour-long blocks of time. And McCullough discovered this during the Oshawa GM strike, which was this real turning point in Ontario labor history, which of course McCullough was not on the side of the union in. And
the United Auto Workers were trying to organize the workers at GM in Oshawa.
And what happened?
What a mess.
It was a big mess. Hepburn was against it. Hepburn basically sent goons to Oshawa.
What were they called?
Sons of Mitches. These were U of T guys. A lot of the story, you can look around Toronto especially, and you can see all of these things, but you don't realize that back in the day, so many oddball things happened at places like Varsity Stadium, where they auctioned off all the provincial government cars when Mitch Hepburn was premier. Or
he was the Trump of the 1930s.
He was the Trump.
Big populist politician.
And McCullough, getting back to the radio, realized that you could do this. You could be this populist leader. And we're still talking about a man who's 31, 32 years old. And he's buying radio time all over the country. And at one point in one of his radio speeches, he says these words about how powerful he is. That you can get behind me. I'm going to be this great leader. And but Mitch gets crazier and crazier, and McCullough can't really deal with Mitch's. I mean, Mitch literally, if you read. There's a book by a Jesuit priest named McKenty about Mitch, which is my favorite.
Neil McKenty.
Neil McKenty.
Great book. Yep.
It's a great book, but he makes it pretty clear that Mitch couldn't get past a bar or a house of prostitution without going in. and the way Mitch lived in the King Edward Hotel here, basically on a floor like a mafia don with goons and sex workers and lots of booze. And
This is the Premier of Ontario.
It's the Premier of Ontario, yeah.
It's a different time, I guess.
It's somewhat different. Well, as far as we know. Yeah.
Okay, don't get a suit here.
Okay.
Mark, but what's interesting about McCullough, though, is that for a newspaper proprietor, he's got his own issues big time. He's got mental health problems.
Yeah.
He's got alcohol problems.
Yeah.
How did those manifest themselves at him?
I think one of the things that makes him click with Hepburn was that the two of them were alcoholics for a while at the same time, and there's no better buddy than a drinking buddy. Then McCullough realized, because of McCullough's own psychological problems, that booze was not a good thing for him. He was also a good friend of an Anglican bishop named Renison, who I think was probably, just by the title of his autobiography of One Day at a Time, kind of gives you an idea of Renison's background. That's an AA slogan. So somebody got McCullough off the booze before he bought the Globe and Mail. He was bipolar, and all through his life, people thought that he did drink.
Now, wait a sec. How do you know because they would not have diagnosed him back in the day as bipolar. So how do you know he was?
Well, they would have called him manic depressive, but it was something that was very nebulous in the research of this book, and believe me, people were not lining up to talk to me about him, and there was almost no documentation that was easy to get. But what I did find was the name of his psychiatrist in New York, and I found that this psychiatrist, his specialty was bipolar people, and he was not a Freudian psychiatrist. He didn't believe in Freudian psychiatry at all. He believed that it was all chemical, and that basically you just gave people shock treatments and got them on their way. Now, this fit really nicely with the way McCullough lived his life, and him being in New York and the fast treatment were the two things that I think were really attractive to McCullough. So McCullough rented an apartment in New York, had basically a secret place down there, and when he broke down, he would go see this guy, Dr. Kennedy, and get shock treatments and come back.
He had electroconvulsive therapy, is
Right.
I guess what it's technically called.
Yeah.
Okay. He eventually ditches Mitch Hepburn. That relationship becomes just too fraught. And he becomes best pals with the future Premier of Ontario, George Drew.
Right.
And I want to read a quote that you have in the book here of Drew campaigning in a by-election in Eastern Ontario in 1936, because this is kind of how they campaigned back in the day. Here's Drew. It is not unfair to remind the French that they are a defeated race and that their rights are only rights because of the tolerance of the English element, who, with all respect to the minority, must be regarded as the dominant race, Drew told his impoverished Protestant audience. This kind of thing played well in Ontario back then?
Hell, it plays well in parts of Ontario now. Yeah, it did. The right-wing populism played very well. There's something that people don't learn anymore of the cleavages in Ontario. In the, I would say from the time of first European settlement in a big way, farmer settlement, to maybe the 70s, was the tremendous cleavage among people from the British Isles on Protestant and Catholic lines, where the Irish were seen as a different race, the French were seen as a different race, and when people talked about race, they talked about French Canadians or Irish Catholics or whatever, and how Toronto was run by a Protestant Ulster
Orange Order.
Minority, to the point where you couldn't get a job with the city of Toronto in the 1960s if you weren't part of the Orange Lodge. Now, all that got swept away really quickly, and good riddance to it, frankly, and kind of sort of forgotten about. But it's very important to the politics of this time. The thing with McCullough was that, and one of the charming things for me is that he's not a bigot. This is not McCullough talking. This is Drew, and he's not a homophobe and the things that you would expect sort of a rich white man of that period.
He might not be those things, but he might have been a fascist.
Well, yeah, we all have our faults.
Well, hang on a sec. I mean, he was promoting one-party government for the province of Ontario during the World War II years.
Yeah, and let's make it clear that his fascism was not an anti-Semitic-based fascism, thank God. I'm not too sure I would have written a positive biography about some guy who was beating that drum. What he was a guy who believed in the sort of technocratic aspects of fascism, the way fascism was portrayed by the media before the war as a more efficient way. The building the autobahns.
Trains run on time.
Trains run on time. We don't have to worry about party politics because there aren't any parties. So he had two things that he got into his head, and they're both stupid. One was get rid of the provinces, and of course that really flew. And the other was get rid of party politics. Now, lots of people believe stupid things, but if you buy the book, you see that at one point the Premier of Ontario and the leader of the opposition in Ontario were prepared to get rid of party politics in this province. And actually, after the Oshawa strike, had a deal to do a coalition government. But it's not just a coalition government. It's pretty clear that they were going to work to merge the parties secretly. So maybe there would have been conservatives and liberals in the government. So they would have all sat together, I guess, and in cabinet. And the Liberals promised to fund the Tory campaign in the next election. So this is really an end to party politics.
But the Toronto Star found out about it, blew the whistle on it.
That happened. And another thing, too, was that Earl Rowe, who later became Lieutenant Governor of Ontario and for a very short time was the interim federal leader of the Tories, went to Ottawa, and he's telling everybody about this great plan. So they get up there, and he goes to the Chateau Laurier, and there's R.B. Bennett and Arthur Meehan are in the Chateau. And
two conservative prime ministers?
Well, Arthur Meehan is a person who's never had a good book written about him. Now, Arthur Meehan was sort of the Darth Vader of Canadian politics at that time. Not a successful politician, gotta say that. Lots of little, like Arthur Meehan records of short-term governments. But he scared the hell out of people like Earl Rowe. And somebody grabbed Earl by the feet and shook something like resembling a brain into his head and sent him back to Toronto, and this deal was off. And then he denied it ever happened. But it did happen. There was all kinds of documentation for it. The Toronto Star knew about it, and like you say, blew the whistle on it. I'm not sure if it would have been legal, but I think the Lieutenant Governor would have gone for it. And Hepburn, not only was Hepburn sold on it, Hepburn was willing to give up the premiership to Rowe, even though Hepburn had a massive majority government and was 18 months away from an election that he handily won. So how in the world anybody talked these guys into doing this is beyond me.
Your protagonist eventually buys another newspaper, the Toronto Telegram. And there's a lawyer who helped him with the paperwork named John Tory. Who's that?
He, I believe, is the grandfather of the present mayor of Toronto. I always have trouble keeping my John Tory straight. But McCullough really got a lousy deal on that paper. He overpaid, but it put him in this position. He hated. This story has a main protagonist, but has really funny sort of protagonists and antagonists, and one of them is Holy Joe Atkinson of the Toronto Star. And McCullough and Atkinson, I in the book, and I write the book in a way it's meant that I want people to read it and have fun with it. And Atkinson is sort of the yin to McCullough's yang.
Yeah.
And so McCullough just relishes the idea of knocking the Star, which he describes in very colorful terms, off its pedestal, going to take them on in the afternoon and get out there. And he uses the Telegram to do the dirty work of his journalistic career. Right? So we get into the 1948 federal election. The Globe is being the Globe and Mail, somewhat as we know it today, and the Telegram is out there taking the pictures that that are embarrassing to Louis Saint Laurent, and really exaggerating the George Drew, who's running for prime minister, he's running as the leader of the federal Tories, and he's of course put up as a Telegram like he's winning, it's going to be great, he's just got it in the bag, and of course he's losing by a long shot. So yeah, and of course in Toronto you have this newspaper war that is still somewhat famous between the Telegram and the Star, and McCullough is the owner of the Telegram and the first part of that newspaper war.
And was he still owning the Telly in 71 when it folded?
No, he died. Well, he died in 52.
But
right.
I mean, his estate or anything like that?
John Bassett bought the Telegram right after he died, but Bassett was his sort of right-hand man. Him and John McFarlane, who and JDM, we called him when I worked at the Sun as a kid. These guys were the sort of main brains of the Telegram, because by then McCullough was spread so thin he couldn't really run this war side. And he it was on Melinda Street where they stayed right through until they built the building. The Globe ended up on Front Street, and yeah, he. And talking about 71, and it's a bit of a leap here, but if McCullough's career, it's only 16 years long. When you think about it, he buys the Globe and the Mail and Empire in 1936, and he's dead in 1952, and he just flies across like a comet through those 16 years, and he's on a different time than the rest of us because he even ages faster. He's almost in dog years. And I think, when you say 71, if he had lived another 19 years, so what would he have been? In his mid-60s, this guy would have gone toe-to-toe with Pierre Trudeau. He would have been around for the Diefenbaker, the Pearson, and the Trudeau years, especially like in the late 60s and into the 70s. Easily have been a big media player at that time. So we may have only seen half of what could have been.
I'm not going to give away the ending in as much as the manner of his death is controversial and extraordinary.
Yeah.
I'm not going to give that away. But after his death in 52, the Globe and Mail takes his picture down.
Yeah.
They take his name off the masthead. Yeah. It's almost like he never existed. Why did they do that?
It wasn't the Globe and Mail that we know of today. I want to make that very clear. Thanks, Phil. Phil Crawley. The paper was sold to the Webster family in Montreal. There was a stigma about his death, about the rumors, and I'm not going to say whether they're confirmed or not of how he died. And his death was certainly something that Toronto felt very hard. So it wasn't like he had fizzled out and no one cared. People did care. So this is a deliberate thing. If you look at the Globe and Mail, you won't see George McCullough's name on there. You'll see George Brown's name on there.
Who founded the Globe.
Who founded the Globe. And you won't see the Mail and Empire people because they're embarrassed about that too. It's Sir John A. founded the Mail and Empire. It's John A. Macdonald. But he was erased. He was deliberately erased from history. He was erased by the newspaper at first, and then by his own wife. According to members of his family I talked to, she married George Drew later on.
Isn't that unbelievable?
I know, small town, small world.
His widow remarried George Drew after his death.
Who had in his files, through all those years, memos and stuff of dirt on George McCullough.
In case he needed it.
In case he needed it. His best buddy, the guy that was pushing him into 24 Sussex or whatever. I guess it would have been 24 Sussex. No, not quite. But who was pushing him into the premiership in Ontario and the premiership in Ottawa. He always kept the dirt on him from his days as a stockbroker. And then McCullough died, and George Drew's wife, who was a character in her own right, she passed away. And the two of them got married, Phyllis McCullough and George Drew. George McCullough's papers stuck around for a while. John Saywell at York University was a historian. He was able to use them for a paper that he wrote. And before he passed away, I was able to talk to him, and he said, no, I gave them back to Phyllis, and then she burned them. So I was left with complete scorched earth. And other people tried to write a book about McCullough and found the same thing, that there was just nothing. And it was this huge job of rebuilding his papers. He has stuff in the House of Lords, stuff in Ottawa and Toronto, in archives, snippets from books, oral histories, everything I could get my hands on to be able to put together enough for a book. Plus the fact he owned a newspaper, so I kind of knew where his head was at. But yeah, well, when you talk about that, when you talk about the picture coming down, it really is like the damning of this man's memory. And I think it was probably the cruelest thing anybody could do to him, because he loved to be known. He wanted to be famous. He moved among really famous people, the sort of jet set of the time. If anybody had told him before he died that nobody would remember him 50 years later, I'm sure he would have been appalled.
Well, guess what? They will now, thanks to your work.
And it feels good to bring him back. Yeah, I have mixed feelings about him. I like him. I don't like the fact he's a fascist. But as you know, I hope that if I was ever worth a biography, that it would get written about me. So,
big men feared him.
They did.
They did. That's Mark Burry, whose new book, Big Men Fear Me, The Fast Life and Quick Death of Canada's Most Powerful Media Mogul, and tells the story of George McCullough. Mark, thanks for joining us here at TVO.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, October 18th, 2022. The 40th anniversary, incidentally, of the death of former Ontario Premier John Robarts. Please check out my column on the TVO website on why we should know more about Mr. Robarts, beyond the fact that he's got a big library in Toronto named after him. Meanwhile, it's been 75 years since Britain's partition of India and Pakistan. Tomorrow, why those two countries have been estranged ever since. Also, a look at China's suddenly flagging economy. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.